Subsidies are payments by the government to firms. It can be defined as the opposite of taxes, where firms pay the government extra money per unit of production. Subsidies are also done typically on a per unit output basis. It aims at lowering production costs, and thus the market price, while raising output and consumption as well as firm revenues. The main objective of subsidies is to increase the consumption of certain goods by lowering the price. And such goods are often those that are positive to society, for example, healthcare. So let's have a look at this idea in a graph. Let's say we're talking about vaccines, since they're being consumed now more than ever. Before the subsidy, the vaccine market was producing at Q1 at a price of P1, where supply and demand intersects. And the government obviously realizes that vaccines are positive to society, which is why they would think that they should lower the market price in order to let more people have access to them. So how would they do that? They would provide subsidies to the vaccine producers so they can produce vaccine with lower costs and in turn decrease the market price. By allowing more access to vaccines with lower costs, the government's aim would be to minimize the spread of disease. So as you would have learned before, this is a source of non-price determinant that increases supply, meaning there was some external force that allowed producers to increase their production, which was the government in this case. So we see the supply curve shift to the right from the subsidies. And now let's see changes in price and quantity. The market price for vaccines dropped from P1 to P2 to allow more access throughout consumers. Following the decrease in price, consumers are now demanding more quantities of vaccine, shown by the increase from Q1 to Q2. So the government has succeeded in letting more people get vaccines at cheaper prices. And while P2 is the market price for consumers, the price which producers receive is up here, which is higher than the initial market price at P1. So let's say P1 was $6 and P2 was $5. And if we assume that the per unit subsidy is $2, then the price producers receive is $7. This is because they sell the vaccine at $5, but really earn $7 per unit sold, as the government supports them $2 on a per unit basis. So you can see that the consumer expenditure before was this rectangular area, whereas now it's represented by this rectangle. And because they gain access to more quantities of vaccine at lower prices, consumer surplus increases from this triangle to a larger one here. And meanwhile, producer surplus has also increased as they sell more at higher prices. So it's a mutually beneficial aid for producers and consumers. And the total amount of money the government spent is the rectangle here, which is the amount of increase in price per unit times the quantity they produce. And this is actually where deadweight loss happens when you minus the government expenditure to the increase in consumer and producer surplus. Therefore, this leftover triangle here is represented as the deadweight loss. So let's get into stakeholder analysis. Consumers are affected by the fall in the price of the goods and the increase in the quantity purchased. Both these changes make them better off. Producers are also better off because they receive a higher price and produce a larger quantity. The price and quantity effects translate into increases in revenues. The government pays a subsidy, which is a burden on its budget. To obtain the revenues for the subsidy, the government may have to reduce expenditures elsewhere in the economy, or may have to use taxes, or may have to run a budget deficit, where government expenditure is greater than tax revenues. Whatever the case, the impact on the government's budget is negative. In a market perspective, the granting of a subsidy results in greater consumer and producer surplus. However, society loses overall due to government spending on the subsidy. Since the loss from government spending is greater than the gain of consumer and producer surplus, welfare loss results, reflecting allocative inefficiency, which in this case is due to overproduction. So to evaluate subsidies, of course they are good for us consumers when buying goods at lower prices, and also for producers getting to produce more at lower prices. But what are the costs of that? It's the loss of society in the form of deadweight losses. This will be elaborated later in market failure.